In this video, we're going to talk about body cavities and serous membranes. A cavity in the human body is an open area in which you can find organs. There are two major body cavities of the human body. The first one is called the posterior or dorsal body cavity, and the second one is called the anterior or ventral body cavity. And each of these cavities can be further subdivided. Looking at the posterior cavity has two subdivisions: the cranial cavity and the vertebral canal. Next, the anterior cavity has three subdivisions. The first subdivision is the thoracic cavity. The second subdivision is the abdominal cavity, and the third subdivision is the pelvic cavity. Sometimes the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity are combined and referred to as the abdominal pelvic cavity. Next, we're going to take a look at the anterior cavity from an anterior view. Remember, the anterior cavity is made up of the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic cavity. The thoracic cavity has three subdivisions. The first is the mediastinum. The mediastinum is where you find respiratory passageways and the heart. The second cavity is called the pericardial cavity. The pericardial cavity is where you'll find the heart. And the third cavity is called the pleural cavity. And the pleural cavity is where you'll find the lungs. And finally, as mentioned previously, the abdominal pelvic cavity has two subdivisions. The first subdivision is the abdominal cavity, and the second subdivision is the pelvic cavity. Next, we're going to take a look at the parts of serous membrane. Now, serous membrane is one of many different types of membranes found in the human body. And the reason why I choose to discuss the serous membrane now is because the serous membrane is the membrane that covers organs. There are four parts of a serous membrane. The first part is called the visceral serous membrane. The second part is called the serous cavity. The third part is called the serous fluid, and the fourth part is called the parietal serous membrane. The visceral serous membrane is the membrane that touches the organ itself. The parietal serous membrane is the outermost membrane. In between the visceral and parietal serous membranes is a cavity called the serous cavity, and within the serous cavity you have a substance called serous fluid, which acts as a shock absorber and helps reduce friction. Let's take a look at the serous membrane that surrounds the heart, called the pericardium. There are four parts to the pericardium. The first part is called the visceral pericardium, or the membrane that touches the heart itself. The second part is the parietal pericardium, which is the outermost membrane of the heart. In between the visceral and parietal pericardium is the pericardial cavity, and within the pericardial cavity you have serous fluid or pericardial fluid. The membrane that surrounds the lungs is called the pleura, and the pleura has four parts as well. The first part is called the visceral pleura, and this is the membrane that attaches directly to the lungs. The second part is called the parietal pleura, and this is the outermost membrane. In between the visceral pleura and parietal pleura is a space called the pleural cavity, and within the pleural cavity you have pleural fluid. The serous membrane that surrounds abdominal pelvic organs is called the peritoneum, and the peritoneum has four parts. The first part is called the visceral peritoneum, which is the membrane that attaches directly to the abdominal pelvic organs. You have the parietal peritoneum, which is the outermost membrane, and in between the visceral and parietal peritoneum you have the peritoneal cavity, and within the peritoneal cavity you have serous fluid or peritoneal fluid.